would you please welcome Margaret O'Mara to the National Archives.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank all of you for coming out today and to the National Archives. I've been to the archives as a researcher. I have been here as a citizen, as a tourist, as a former resident of Washington, D.C., and a resident of other parts of the United States, and it's just such an honor and a pleasure to be here as a speaker and to talk about my book, Pivotal Tuesdays. I'm also so pleased that you all have exhibited this interest in such an obscure subject that no one ever seems to pay any attention to, presidential elections. Why can't we get the papers to write about presidential candidates? I don't know. But more seriously, we're more than a year away from Election Day, 2016. Or maybe less than a year now, aren't we? But we've already seen some remarkable moments emerge in this election cycle. We've had a huge celebrity who candidates on both the right and the left ends of the political spectrum. We're seeing how new media, social media, is changing campaigning, changing the way that candidates and their campaigns communicate to voters, the way in which voters interact with one another and interact with the people who want to be their president. And we also are experiencing an immense amount of gridlock, partisan infighting that is causing many observers to throw up their hands and saying, is this whole thing going down the tubes? Well, is it? What's new about 2015 and 2016? What's not? What can we learn from earlier presidential elections that will help us make sense of this one? So, this is a book about 4 elections that occurred between 1900 and 2000. And of course, there were a lot of elections that happened. Hold on a second. I think I'm going to need to go back to our slideshow. Slideshow. All right, let's see if this works this time. There we go. All right, back on track. Didn't lose you. So I could have chosen a lot of elections. There were many moments, pivotal moments, political moments in the 20th century. There are also other elections that I didn't write about that arguably have been written about a lot and arguably are very good fodder for a book that's putting all these in context. I could have written about the election of 1948 when Strom Thurmond bolted from the Democratic Party to run as a states' rights candidate. I could have written, of course, about 1960, the election between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. I could have written about, of course, Ronald Reagan's landslide election of 1980 and the conservative revolution that came in his wake. I also could have written about more recent elections, 2000, 2008, both historic in their own ways. But I chose to write about these 4. And why these 4? Well, one of the reasons is personal. I was a campaign staffer on the 1992 campaign working for the Clinton-Gore team, and I had some personal recollections to bring to that story. But more broadly, all 4 of the elections had common threads that I thought were good ways that knit together and show how different electoral cycles feed into one another and also contrast from each other. They all occurred at moments of economic and cultural change, sometimes tremendous economic and cultural change. In 1912, America is still reeling from the transition from farm to factory, from countryside to city, the birth of industrial capitalism and all of the consequences of that, generation of great wealth, but also generation of great inequality and of other social ills. In 1932, of course, you have an economic crisis unprecedented in the history of the United States, the Great Depression. 1968, a moment of incredible cultural change, of countercultural change, of change on both the left and the right, and the creation of grassroots movements who still are shaping politics today. And then 1992 is the first presidential election after the end of the Cold War. It's the first presidential election in which cable TV becomes the dominant medium through which the campaign is fought and won. And it also is the first election with a baby boomer generation president and candidate, where different issues become salient in the campaign and in the election. So let's start with one of my favorite people to write about as a presidential historian, Teddy Roosevelt. And 1912 is the year that was distinctive for many reasons, and one of them being that an ex-president decided to once again throw his hat into the ring. It is, again, a pivotal moment when the conversation, because there has been so much economic change, the conversation in 1912 revolves around making government do more to rein in the power of industrial capitalism. So if you dial back to the 19th century, not only did American presidents have a different role in American life, and I can talk about more of that in our discussion after my talk, but the government wasn't that big. You didn't have all of these large buildings along Constitution Avenue and Independence Avenue. Most Americans encountered the government on a daily basis through going to the post office. And other than that, the military and the post office were really the only kind of places of connection between an ordinary American and their federal government. And Roosevelt is a pivotal figure in that he served as president at this moment of kind of muddling through what the federal government should do as corporations get bigger, as the population gets bigger, as society gets more complex. And he serves, he inherits the office after the assassination of William McKinley, of course, is reelected in 1904, has a rather public debate about whether to run again in 1908, decides not to, and hands over the keys to his appointed successor, William Howard Taft, who was a friend and an ally and someone that Roosevelt believed would be a good caretaker of Roosevelt's progressive legacy. That didn't quite turn out as Roosevelt expected. So Teddy leaves the Oval Office, steams off on a steamer to Africa to go on safari, as only Colonel Roosevelt could. And he's gone for over a year. He's in Africa, and then he's in Europe on a speaking tour. And meanwhile, William Howard Taft is back here in Washington, disappointing him. He's firing some of his close allies, close confidants in the government. He's still closely tied with kind of the old guard in the Republican Party, and he's a vastly different personality. He's someone who, when his description of the 1908 presidential campaign was, quote, "the most uncomfortable 4 months of my life." So we'll all just sit and marinate on the fact that the campaign was 4 months long as we sit here, we've been living with this cycle for this long. And Roosevelt is gone, and when he comes back, he is greeted as a conquering hero. And so, one of the conversations that's been running around the phenomenon of Donald Trump over the past summer in particular is this, well, America is just obsessed with celebrity, and he's a famous person, and so, and kind of saying we've all become so very, very shallow. Well, America was obsessed with ex-President Theodore Roosevelt. And when he returns in June of 1910 to New York City, steams into the harbor, hundreds of boats come out to greet him. Thousands of people line the streets, brass bands play, flags wave, and headlines across the nation. Here's the Tacoma Times in the Pacific Northwest, far, far away, that devotes its whole front page to Teddy Roosevelt's return. He is an outsized public figure, and he's someone who people not only admire but also are fascinated by. He comes back in 1912, and he's spouting some more radical ideas, 1910, some more radical ideas than he'd even propounded as president. He was talking about more government intervention into markets, doing more to help people to rectify the economic inequalities that were coming in the wake of the growth of these big corporations, of railroads, of steel and oil companies. And so he goes on this huge speaking tour across the country. He barnstorms the country, sounding more and more progressive at every stop, and more radical, kind of picking up on ideas that had kind of been on the fringe of the political conversation and making them more mainstream, and having a really robust reception. Now, part of this, again, was curiosity, and part of it was genuine hunger for change. And this is something we see over and over again, that outsider candidates, candidates who are pushing the envelopes of the political conversation, get traction when people are hungry for a new message, when they're dissatisfied with the status quo, when they feel that something more or something different needs to be done. Sometimes it's more government, sometimes it's less. And now, of course, Theodore Roosevelt was not the only outsider candidate shaking up the 1912 election as the race grew nearer. You also have Eugene Debs, a socialist. We have a socialist running for president, a former socialist running for president now, and Gene Debs was a true socialist running as a socialist. Ran for president a number of times, and 1912 was the year that he got the most votes. He got over 1 million votes in 1912. And Roosevelt is picking up some of the things that Debs is saying, definitely more strongly radical, further to the left, as we would put him on the spectrum. But there is a hunger for new ideas. And so outsider candidates are getting some momentum. So by this point, as people are having to declare, for a long time, Roosevelt says, I'm not going to run, I'm not going to run. And then he just keeps on getting these big crowds, big crowds, big crowds. And he decides to run against his old friend and ally, William Howard Taft, for the Republican nomination. He doesn't get it. Taft marshals the party faithful. At the convention, he ends up the victor. Roosevelt bolts and runs as a third-party candidate, the head of the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party. And what happens at the end of the day? None of the people I've talked about win. Woodrow Wilson wins. And why does he do that? Because Roosevelt splits. It takes away a lot of Taft's vote. If you look at the electoral map, you can see states that otherwise had gone Republican in the past went for Roosevelt, including my home state of Washington and also California. But Wilson is also picking up on these conversations about government doing more. This is when the Democratic Party was the party of small government, of states' rights, of Washington, D.C. doing less. But Wilson, in this moment where clearly the U.S. government has to do more than just have a post office, have an army, that he runs and then governs as a much more interventionist, progressive guy. This is the moment when the Democratic Party starts becoming the party of more activist central government. Now, let me go now to another progressive, someone who is coming from the same political moment, the political milieu of Roosevelt, Wilson, and the like, Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover is now remembered as, when there's those rankings of who the greatest presidents of the 20th century are, he's usually not ranked very highly. When I talk to my students, college students, about Herbert Hoover and ask them what they know about Herbert Hoover, they'll say, oh, Great Depression, Hoovervilles, failure. Well, Herbert Hoover was once one of the most famous men in America, one of the most admired men in America. He was so famous that his name was a verb. In World War I, this has an extraordinary life story. He was an orphan from Oregon. He goes to Stanford University when it was tuition-free back in the 1890s. And he is a self-made millionaire within a few decades. This is still a relatively young man as a mining engineer. He's tapped by Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, to run the Food Administration in World War I, a huge logistical operation, figuring out how to conserve food, how to get food to the troops, how to get food to people in war-torn countries, both during and after the war. And housewives would talk about Hooverizing and when they were economizing on food. He then goes on to become Commerce Secretary, in the 1920s, and then is elected president in 1928. And so not only is he renowned for his managerial expertise, he's really good at running things and taking a real thorny logistical problem and making it work. But he also is a master of media. He's really good at working new media. This is a guy in 1928 who has talking motion pictures as a campaign ads using talkies. They'd only been out for a year. So rather than being this kind of fuddy-duddy failure, Herbert Hoover was a modern man. He understood the power of words, the power of images, the power of messages. He once said, "The world talks in phrases. The world lives by phrases, and we are good advertisers." He understood that politics and policy was something that could and should be packaged as if it were a consumer product, that there were very precise ways to target and market to people. So again, was very forward-thinking. Another person who was acutely aware of public image was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he became so acutely aware of this in large part because he had to work very, very, very hard to project an image of himself that was at odds with reality. As we all know, he contracted polio in the early 1920s, was disabled for the remainder of his life, and went to great lengths to disguise the fact that he could not walk unassisted. I love this photograph, which is a rarely seen photograph, and I wish that I'd had the rights in time to get it into the book. But this is a picture of Franklin Roosevelt as shortly after being elected governor of New York, and in a classic Roosevelt pose where he is projecting strength, projecting confidence. And of course, he's leaning on a cane. People knew he had polio. People knew that he, wasn't completely able, but it was very important to convince voters and to convince the press that he was up for the job, not only the job of governor, but then the job of president. But if you look very, very closely here, you'll see there's a second cane very artfully concealed behind his leg. He is holding himself up with all of his strength, trying to look casual, to keep himself upright. So in 1932, you have two modern politicians who are masters of new media, who understand the power of image, the power of short phrases, of sound bites, even though sound bites were a little longer than they are today. They probably, both Hoover and Roosevelt probably would have been very good at Twitter, perhaps. But the game has changed. And so you can be the master of message, the master of political communication. But if reality is at odds, no amount of phrases and images can work against a hard economic reality of the Great Depression. I should give it an additional note about this photograph, which is a soup kitchen in Chicago run by Al Capone. So the Great Depression is of such a magnitude, such a collapse, a crisis of capitalism that has not been encountered before in American history, that it completely floors Hoover and all his advisors, and frankly, political professionals on both sides of the aisle, of its magnitude, its duration, and the fact that all the old remedies didn't work. Hoover actually, again, the master of phrases, as the economy started going south, he said, we can't talk about this as a panic. We can't talk about it as anything but a depression. A depression was understood to be something that wasn't that bad. It was just a depression, not falling off a cliff, just depression. We'll come out of it. And then the depression becomes great. And all of the tools that the government had, again, the federal government, despite a couple of decades of progressive reform, is still not that big. You do not have these large agencies that can intervene, that can stimulate the economy. It's very much dependent on private markets making things work. And Hoover did not realize this until too late. And by the time that his administration was making more serious interventions in the economy, and they did, the Reconstruction Finance Administration, for example, is one example of a Hoover-initiated piece of the New Deal. But he didn't catch it until too late, and because even he was the master of management, his reputation as the great engineer then didn't work when he was trying to engineer an end to the Great Depression, and he couldn't do it. Roosevelt takes advantage of this masterfully. This was a year when any incumbent would have had a very difficult time, but a particularly difficult time with someone who was able to pick up on the Americans' need, not for policy prescriptions, because if you go back and see what Roosevelt said on the stump in 1932, he was blissfully vague, and we think of him as a real policy wonk. He wasn't. He was about hope and change and big ideas. He got dinged for it, too. There were some voters who were like, he's not saying anything. Like, he's not, I want some meat on the bones. But he talked about the forgotten man. He talked to these voters who were out of work, who were feeling hopeless, and said, we're going to fix this. We need bold solutions. We're going to do something. It's going to be new. He barnstorms the country on the Roosevelt Special, the back of a train. Again, this coming to the people, this image of vitality, of personality, but again, leaning on something, making sure a carefully crafted campaign and image that's reaching to a really frustrated and despondent nation. So okay, Roosevelt is elected, the New Deal, he's reelected, and again, and America enters a period that's understood as sort of a high point of modern liberalism, where government grows larger, where the liberals are in ascendance and the conservatives are in retreat. But one of the things I want to convey in my talk today is that we are neither a conservative nation nor a liberal nation, nor is it right to say that there are eras of conservatism and eras of liberalism. Yes, there are moments when one side or the other is more dominant. But let's think it more as a shifting center, where the range of political possibility shifts a little to the left and a little to the right, depending on the moment and depending on who is articulating the message. Because even in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, the high point of American liberalism, there is a conservative coalition that is building in strength, that is both grassroots and top-down. It includes Herbert Hoover, who, after he's defeated in 1932, retreats back to Palo Alto, California, to Stanford University, and from there becomes a fierce critic of Roosevelt's policies and this broader, more interventionist Keynesian approach to governance. But it also includes the grassroots. It includes ordinary Americans who, by 1964, mobilized to a degree that they got Barry Goldwater, a very conservative Republican, nominated as the Republican nominee. Now, of course, Goldwater loses in a landslide, thereby validating all these, both people on the left and the right saying, you can't go that far right. The Republican Party says, we should have had Nelson Rockefeller. We cannot be this extremist, as Barry Goldwater, as he was understood then. And many Democrats said, see, we've got broad-based support for our efforts. It's kind of like Teddy Roosevelt thinking, everyone, I can be president again because I'm gathering these crowds of 10,000 people every place I go. But things change very, very quickly. So 1968, the third election that I write about in the book, is understood as kind of another example of this liberal moment. So much of what we remember and what is written about in 1968 is about the anti-war liberals who upended the Democratic Party. Gene McCarthy, whose rise to political prominence was driven forward by all these young activists, many on college campuses, who got deeply engaged in politics because of the Vietnam War, because of the Vietnam draft, but also more well-known political figures like Robert Kennedy. But 1968, mind you, is also the year when Richard Nixon returns to the political stage. I did get permissions from George Lois, the designer of this wonderful cover, to appear in the book. It is one of my favorite images. So Richard Nixon is, the Democrats are in disarray. Richard Nixon is the most unlikely comeback story, right? He loses in 1960. He loses in 1962 for the governor of California, like not even president, says, you're never going to have Nixon to kick around again. I'm going back to my law firm. And then 1968, he's back. But he's back as a very different candidate. And again, this goes to sort of putting our current moment in context, thinking about the power of image, thinking about the power of media, and how the same politician might repackage themselves and also take advantage of a very different moment in American history. Because of course, between 1960 and 1968, so much changes in terms of how geopolitics, domestic politics, grassroots politics, and culture. Richard Nixon comes back, not as the same Richard Nixon of 1960, and one of the things I would invite all of you guys to do if you're really interested in this, in presidential campaigns and elections, is to visit the website hosted by the American Museum of the Moving Image in New York called The Living Room Candidate, which archives all of the television ads from 1952 forward for the major party candidates. And just for fun, compare a 1960 Richard Nixon ad with a 1968 one. The Nixon 60 ad is very traditional, very kind of the time. It's black and white, all these ads. It'll usually involve him sort of standing like this, or trying to lean on a desk, looking casual, and talking straight to the camera and saying, something serious about an issue of the day. It's not particularly charismatic. There's no, there are no jingles. There's nothing. It's very straightforward, not particularly glamorous. 1968 ads, it's like MTV. They're Technicolor. They're these very fast clips, jangly music. Richard Nixon appears nowhere in them. You just hear his voice saying something very authoritative, paternal about law and order or the need to end the war in Vietnam. His Vietnam ad is masterful. You can't figure out if he's anti-war or not. It sounds like he's a real peacenik. And so that becomes one key to Nixon's victory. But the other key, and this is another important thing to think about, and this is quite honestly the main reason I didn't write about 1980 is because so much of the story of American conservatism, modern American conservatism, can be read into the story of 1968. You see the groundwork being laid for what happens in 1980. Because, of course, you have a Democratic field that not only includes McCarthy and Kennedy, but also includes George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama, who famously stood at the schoolhouse door saying segregation now, segregation forever. When he runs for president, he's not talking about segregation anymore. He's talking to a national audience. He's talking to a national audience of working class, white people living in big cities. These are the people whose grandparents might have voted for Jean Debs in 1912. And they certainly voted for Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. And he's not talking about segregation, but he's talking about rights. He's talking about freedom, talking about taxes, talking about individual freedom and how the government is stomping on it. And it is a very powerful and remarkably effective message. He's picking up on messages that Ronald Reagan used in 1966 when he ran successfully for California governor about law and order, about the need for smaller government. He's picking up on messages used by other politicians not as nationally well-known or remembered, like Claude Kirk, who runs for governor of Florida as a Republican. He was a former Democrat turned Republican in 1966. Talks about your home is your castle, protect it. And that is a nationally resonant message. Talking to people who are very concerned about race and concerned about civil rights and concerned about where they fit in this new America, but not using the same incendiary language. And Nixon also picks up on some of this, talking about freedom, talking about individual rights and law and order. And that is one of the many reasons he won. So the story continues, bridges over the 1970s and 1980s, a moment when both the two major political parties experienced great change. And this, I think, encapsulates in one image what happens to the Democrats in the 1970s. The Democratic Party becomes a much bigger tent, becomes a much more welcoming place for people of color, for women, for the people who were the leftist activist civil rights movements, plural, of the 1960s, find a home in the Democratic Party in the 1970s. But at the same time, the party still has people like George Wallace in it. And this, from 1972, this is a dashiki-clad delegate for the Shirley Chisholm presidential campaign. She runs in 1972. And behind him are supporters of George Wallace trying to be heard. And so there's this great democratic fracture. And ultimately, the George Wallace supporters, the South, leaves the Democratic Party. And this, without the South, it is impossible to win nationally. So, and the Republicans recognize this. So here's Ronald Reagan in Columbia, South Carolina in 1980. This was not Republican territory 20 years before at all. And now it is. So the reddening of the South is a significant shift for the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party. These parties are constantly changing. They're constantly changing in dynamic institutions, which is one reason that the two-party system is so enduring. I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. So this all sets us up for a moment when, and this is, I think, a good lesson in why you should never make predictions too far out. Because this time in the cycle of 1982, a year before, or a year and a half before, George H.W. Bush seemed unbeatable because of the successful Gulf War, because the economy was still pretty good, and no major Democrat was willing to go there because they thought they were going to lose. So you end up with these guys. An unlikely, younger, people whose turn, it wasn't quite their turn to run. They're young, they're in their 40s. People like Jerry Brown, who then and now is governor of California. Jerry Brown is like on Jerry Brown 3.0 now. It's awesome. Paul Tsongas, senator from Massachusetts. Bob Kerrey from Nebraska. Again, Vietnam generation, Vietnam veteran. Tom Harkin, Iowa, and of course, this guy, Bill Clinton, from Arkansas. And the field, this is also a field that is this is a new Democratic Party. This, of course, are the new Democrats. They're more centrist. They are, some of them, like Clinton, are Southerners. And they are picking up on some of these messages about law and order, about reforming welfare, about reinventing government, making government work better, as a way to recapture some of those voters that have been lost to the Republican Party. But then there's a third-party spoiler. And this is one proof point of what a big deal cable television and CNN was in the 1992 election. And I talk about this a lot in the book. Of course, CNN had been around for 12 years before this election rolled around. But this was the first time when it became a decisive force. This was the new media. And what it did was a couple of things. One was it created the 24-hour spin cycle of news, where you have what Clinton consultant Mandy Grunwald called the beast that needed to be fed stories all the time. So things that were little blips became stories, and they endured from cycle to cycle to cycle. When you've got 24/7 to fill with news, and we're now seeing this, now we have multiple cable news stations that are beasts that need to be fed. So much more stuff is news. You don't have just the news you don't have Walter Cronkite with his 30 minutes. You've got a lot of time to fill. So other things come into the cycle. It also requires campaigns to be very, very nimble, to respond very, very, very quickly, sometimes too quickly. And it also feeds on scandal and interesting news, not just the regular news. But the other dimension is it becomes this platform for Ross Perot, who in a series of interviews with Larry King Live was then, as you all may remember, the kind of marquee must-watch, must-see TV on CNN, was talking about his views of what what the country should do. And then on Larry King Live announces that he's going to run as a third-party candidate for president. And Perot's a very interesting figure in that kind of like, kind of like Teddy Roosevelt is straddling between the two candidates. He's maybe more Republican, than Democrat. That one of the Bush campaign's later the reflections that Bush aides said, we just did not take Perot seriously enough. They knew, many of them knew him from Texas, from way back. They really didn't think he'd have much staying power. And of course, the Bush campaign was the one more deeply hurt by Perot. Less on the issues and more because, again, just like in 1912, just like in 1932 and 68, and just like today, Americans were hungry for outsiders and fresh messages. And this guy punched through the clutter with his folksy Ross Perot-isms and was a very different sort of candidate. People understood this billionaire as a man of the people because he was not adhering to any script. But another reason that the victory eventually went, and with the plurality, mind you, of votes, went to Clinton, was the South. This is a button not produced by the Clinton campaign, but not discouraged by it either. But one thing that Bill Clinton did was he went against, the rules are you usually pick a vice president from some other part of the country. You capture a different demographic, right? He picked Al Gore from neighboring Tennessee. Same age, roughly, same Mid-South demographic, but also a new Democrat, a centrist Democrat, someone who had kind of was part of this new wave of the Democratic Party. And together, the two candidates were able to, with both their backgrounds and with the campaign's policy emphases, able to capture enough votes in the formerly solidly Democratic South to win nationally. It was one piece of this victory. But of course, Ross Perot, the third-party spoiler, doesn't win any electoral votes, but he becomes, just like Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, a decisive factor. So what I've tried to do today, and what I have tried to do in this book, is to weave elections into the broader tapestry of American history. That elections are not these kind of fun contests that happen every 4 years or every 2 years, it seems like, but they are reflections of and things that propel economic, cultural, and social change. That they are reflections of America. They are reflections of where American citizens are, what their hopes and dreams are at a given moment. As dysfunctional as we might think the system might be, it has been the way for individuals to have their voice heard. And it gives us some lessons for today. One, the lesson of new media. New media and new technologies reshape how to run and how to win from generation to generation to generation. First it was the newspaper, then it was radio, then it was television, then cable television. So it's the same story all over again. But the campaigns that capture that new media platform most effectively are the ones that do the best. Outsiders gain traction when voters believed established institutions have failed them. And we're often in an anti-establishment moment in this country, but particularly now. And I think that helps us, gives us some insights into why you have individuals like Ben Carson, like Bernie Sanders, and others who are running proudly as outsiders. And it's not a swinging pendulum between left and right. The United States political scene is never entirely one nor the other. And to say that, we're in charge now, so we have a mandate, that's dangerous territory. Instead, let's think about a shifting center. Things that Richard Nixon did as president would be classified as unbearably liberal today. Environmental protection. At one point, he supported a minimum guaranteed income for poor families. This is stuff, this is Bernie Sanders territory, folks. But it was in the world of the late 60s and early 70s that the realm of political possibility was just a few steps to the left. Now it has moved a few more steps to the right. So understanding where that center is and how it's composed of members of both parties and how both parties are actors in the movement between right and left is what we need to think about. So thank you so much for listening to me. I'd be really happy to field your questions. And all that I ask, since this is being taped, is that if you have a question, come to one of the 2 microphones on either side, and I'll take people in order that they show up. Thank you.
I enjoyed very much the talk, and I'm not going to buy 1 book. I'm going to buy 2 books for somebody. But I just had one question. I like your selection, but what about 1948, where you had 2 outsiders?
Yeah.
You didn't mention Henry Wallace, who
Yeah,
had been Roosevelt's
that's right.
vice president
Yeah.
in 1940, and then literally 4 conventions held at the same place in Philadelphia,
Yeah.
and then Thurman breaking off, and then Thurman, and then Wallace. Why didn't you pick 48? And second, my only criticism is that in 68, Nixon, Humphrey, do you buy the theory that you didn't go in, this is into specifics, that if Humphrey had broken with Johnson over the war, it might have actually made a difference. He did on the weekend before the first Tuesday in November,
Yeah.
but that would have been entirely different.
Yeah.
So those are 2 unrelated questions, but I'd like your views on both of them.
Great. I will say 1948 almost made it in, and it was a matter of space. And also because I wanted to think about how I could talk about other elections kind of as bridging between the ones that I discussed in depth. And 1948 is interesting, and I think there's a lot of there. Again, you can really dig deep into the changing nature of the South and anticipating what happens. I thought it would be easier to really go there by talking about 68 and kind of the aftermath of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and how that was changing the very solid South. But the breakaway of the kind of the fractures within the Democratic Party were there. I mean, they were there, in 1932. They were there. The New Deal is this,
And Thurman was a Democrat.
And Thurman was a Democrat. Yeah. And so he sort of exemplified this kind of, for Roosevelt as a reformer, had this constraint, building these social welfare programs, the first iteration of Social Security, who were the classes of workers, agricultural workers, household workers that were excluded from it. Majority African American, those are almost all the African Americans in the South worked in those job categories. So it was more, I don't have a perfect answer of, oh, well, there's a reason why I wasn't in. It was mostly because I wish I could have, but I tried to address those in other ways. The Humphrey question's a great one. Woulda, coulda, shoulda. I don't know. I would have been surprised. It wasn't in Humphrey. He did that so late in the game. It just reflected who Humphrey was. He was a loyal guy. He was a party man. He was a stand-up guy. And the difficulty that he had was that he could have disavowed, Johnson's war as much as he could have. He was still Johnson's vice president. And he also, didn't run in the primaries. He kind of comes in as this candidate kind of to sort of fix the immense, fractures that are happening in the Democratic Party. It's, Robert Kennedy had just won the California primary in June when he's assassinated immediately after. How, and there's been a lot of people who've sort of talked about what if he had lived and who would, and he had been the nominee, how would it have changed? Don't know. There was a lot going on there, and I think we shouldn't discount the power of the silent majority, of Nixon's silent majority, of people who were really anxious about the immensity of social change that they were seeing happening around them. Thanks. Yes?
I've often wondered why Teddy Roosevelt was so wrong about William Howard Taft. Is it a case of Roosevelt seeing what he wanted to see, or did one or both of them change?
That's a great question. The Roosevelt-Taft friendship is just a fascinating one. It itself is a subject of books. And Roosevelt was such I see their dynamic as, of course, Roosevelt was the alpha dog of all alpha dogs, and Taft was a pretty, brilliant man. Oh, such a brilliant man, and very, very, Teddy was always one very quick to take credit for things. And Taft was the opposite. He had this stellar career where he just, kind of went from strength to strength because he was just so smart and so good. We kind of forget the Taft, the real Taft. He kind of is lost to this. He's sort of seen as this, marginal figure, kind of comical figure. He's not. He's this extraordinary man. But, when people say, so why have you come so far so fast? He's like, oh, I was just, my plate was right side up when things were falling. It's just kind of, I just was in the right time, right place. It's not me. It's kind of the opposite of, a lot of other people who are say, oh yeah, it's all because I'm so smart. But he really wanted to be a Supreme Court justice, which he eventually did. So I think that they had a very convivial relationship. I think that Roosevelt felt that Taft was going to be his guy and just do what he hoped that he would do. And he got in the Oval Office and he said, I'm president. I'm going to not always do what Teddy would do. And ironically, in some ways, you could mark him as he was more progressive. He kind of pushed things in a little more activist direction. But Teddy saw him as a just a party hack and I think Roosevelt just didn't, he hated not being president anymore. He was, wasn't even 60. He was really young, really vital, really, and he just, you can see him going on this barnstorming tour in 1910, 1911, and he's just getting more excited every place he goes, and the crowds are huge. Now, mind you, when you look at read into between the lines of newspaper accounts, and they're observing that there are people who are true believers and there are people who are just curious. They're like, I want to see Teddy in person. So they come out and watch, but they're just watching. They're not cheering. But he really loved the spotlight. He was sort of hungry. And he also, I think, felt that the Taft was not doing enough. That there was, he clearly, in his time away, and particularly his time in Europe in 1910, really kind of soaked in some of these ideas that are emerging in European states about the welfare state, about government, the role of government in industrial life, and had much stronger views about what should be done and he thought that Taft was just a little too much of a status quo guy. Yeah. Yes.
Sometimes people think of the word pivotal as synonymous for the phrase turning point. Mm-hmm. So I was a little surprised that you didn't mention that starting in 1932, Democrats had a plurality or a majority in 7 of the next 9 presidential campaigns.
Yeah.
Starting in 1968, Republicans had a plurality or a majority in 5 of the next 6 presidential campaigns. Mm-hmm. And starting in 1992, Democrats again had plurality or majority in 5 of the next 6 presidential campaigns. But that's not my question. My question really is, is there something about substantial third-party candidacies that exemplify a pivotal election? And should we expect that this coming election will be pivotal only if there is a substantial third-party candidacy, mm-hmm. and probably not otherwise?
That's a super question. I hadn't thought about it in that way, but I think that's right. So third parties, Richard Hofstadter, one of my illustrious predecessors in the history professor of business, once said, third parties are like bees. They sting and then they die. And they sting. And I think that that a third-party candidate or independent, and a third-party figure can be someone like George Wallace, who's a candidate of one of the 2 major parties, but is kind of pushing the whole conversation in a different direction. When they gain traction, it usually is a reflection of the fact that the economic mood is there's economic instability, there's change, enough change that people feel that they really need something different than what they're getting. And you also see this a bit in 2000 with Ralph Nader, where a lot of Nader voters beforehand, one of their reasons was they would say, well, Gore and Bush, there's no difference. They're just two guys. I think George W. Bush showed everyone that he wasn't the same president as Al Gore. But there was this real kind of belief that you have these 2 kind of establishment parties, and they weren't really offering fresh solutions. But when these outsiders, the sting of the bee, of the third party bee, is that they get these to the 2 major parties, and again, the durability of our modern party system is one of the reasons that it's so durable, is because it kind of accommodates the Ross Perot platform. Talking about the reduction of the national debt, for example, talking about just fiscal responsibility was something that Ross Perot got both Bush and Clinton, they had to talk about more than they were talking about it before. So you do have, I'll have to think more about this sort of correlation causality, because I think there is something to that. When you think if you're really sort of pivoting to a different political era, it's in part because the parties themselves are finding a way, even after the election, to kind of accommodate the voters that were supporting this independent candidacy.
Yeah. Hi, Professor O'Mara. Thanks for an engaging talk about a probably even more engaging book. I don't have the knowledge of my constitutional lawyer friend, David, who asked the previous question. I'm going to follow up on that. And ask you to use the crystal ball that you don't have.
Yes.
You did a very good job today of using history to understand the present. So now we're going to take you to the Republican field of the 782 or however many it is today, people running. If you were forced to make a guess today, okay, and it's going to be a two-pronged question, and then we'll follow up later. The two-pronged question is this. Who do you see at the end of this emerging as a Republican candidate, and why, or if you have a why? And do you think if it's not Donald Trump or Ben Carson, would either of them be encouraged by their support, even though it's so early in the cycle, that they might run based on their support? And then the easier question, when you come back up, I always ask, you spend so much time with these presidential candidates and presidential winners. Do you have a favorite or a non-favorite, or both?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Crystal ball, well, it's always dangerous to have a history professor with a crystal ball, right? But I think there's some patterns. I would be, and my read is based on, thinking about history. I would be very surprised if Ben Carson or Donald Trump ended up being the nominee. Now, in 1963, people would have been really surprised if Barry Goldwater had been the nominee. But I do think that whoever is the Republican nominee will be someone that is going to have to accommodate some of the message, the use of media, that some of these outsiders that have gotten all the attention have gotten. Now, they're obviously, in the general, everyone moves closer to the center, right? So everyone's kind of running for their base. But the primaries are going to be really interesting. And I think what makes this crystal ball particularly cloudy this time, and why the field has been so large, is because of the nature of campaign finance and kind of the post-Citizens United era, where if you have one very, very deep-pocketed and enthusiastic contributor, you can launch a national campaign. I think another dimension is the cost of media is different. Donald Trump he's redefined free media, right? Now that's been around for a while. Bill Clinton in '92 was very good at that, going on the Arsenio Hall show and other things like that, getting headlines for those sorts of things. But it's a tough call. I would be surprised. I'd be surprised in part because there's been so much heat and light put on these candidates on the edges now. Third party run, all bets are off. I don't know. I don't think you can. People may promise that they're not going to do it, but Roosevelt promised he wasn't going to run either. So there's precedent here. It's hard to pick a favorite. What I'd really love, there's so many great personalities, right? There's a reason that there's a big presidential history business and why we write books and you guys buy books. It's great stories. But what I really enjoy is kind of recovering and uncovering the stories of people who are misinterpreted by kind of conventional wisdom today. Herbert Hoover is an example of that. And then other stories that really showcase their humanity. One of the things that I learned, and one of the reasons I teach this as a history professor, is because I worked here as one of the kids that come to Washington every year to work in the executive branch or work on Capitol Hill. And when you are, even if you're young and you're a small person in this political machine, just being this close to lawmaking, policymaking, and leadership gives you a very different perspective on power. You realize these are human beings. The presidency, it's on-the-job training. There's no president's school you can go to. And it's extraordinary. Everyone's trying to do the best they can. We may disagree on how they're doing or what they believe is the best. But it is these are human beings, and they are ordinary men, and we hope there'll be more women that join them in the coming years that are just trying to figure out how to run the largest, most powerful country on earth. And it is a daunting, daunting job. It amazes me that people wake up in the morning and say, I could be president. I don't think I'm going to be running anytime soon. It's a big, big job. But to show their humanity and then to remind people that they have this multi-dimensional life story, that with these phases in their careers, that everyone has their up years and their down years. Not a single president, even our two-termers, even the ones that roost at the best of the best, they had moments where things were really, really going sideways for them, where their popularity was going, where all the things they were trying, the spaghetti they were throwing on the wall was not sticking. And then eventually, it's one of the reasons that it's good to have, looking back over a long period of time, we have time to appreciate, to kind of get past partisan bias about what we think these people stood for, and actually appreciate them as figures of history and as representatives of a moment in time. So thank you for your questions, and thank you all for coming. It was really great. Thanks.